How's it going this week on the Nonprofit News Feed, a podcast brought to you by Whole Whale? We're bringing you some news from May 1st. First off, it's May. Wow, there you go. And we're also discussing a kind of ongoing story where Pantheon, a very popular hosting platform, is facing some backlash. So we're going to try to suss out what's going on and where we see that story right now. Nick, how's it going?
It's going good, George. It's been a weird day. Like every other hour, it alternates in this city between sunny and like the Dementors are coming to eat your children. Right now, it's dark and brooding, but hopefully the sun comes out soon. But back to what you were talking about. Our first story of this week comes from reporting by ARS Technica that says that Pantheon heroes are departing as the platform faces backlash for hosting hateful websites. So, in recent weeks, controversy has erupted primarily over LinkedIn, where website operations platform Pantheon is hosting websites for influential anti-LGBTQ and anti-immigrant organizations, including organizations such as the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, which is designated as a hate group by the SPLC, or Southern Poverty Law Center. So the backlash began on a LinkedIn thread, which, George, I'm sure you've read more of, we'll go into, is quite spicy. Several developers and Pantheon supporters voiced their concerns as Pantheon heroes, which are essentially developer-oriented cheerleaders for Pantheon, some of which have withdrawn from the program in protest because Pantheon co-founder Josh Koenig confirmed that the platform would continue hosting the controversial websites, citing their commitment to being an open platform. Some pointed out that Pantheon's terms of service prohibit abusive or offensive content, and the company's position on content states that they generally refrain from moderating customer content, however. So a lot of this controversy seems to be trickling down into the Pantheon Heroes program, which was kind of developed by Pantheon to have these developer-oriented, again, kind of like brand ambassadors almost, for the service. However, since Pantheon's decision to continue hosting these, quote, hate websites, several developers have quit that program, expressing disappointment and feeling conflicted. So, George, this is complicated, and I want to hear your take, but I think the overall gist of this is moderation's a little bit more complicated of an issue when you move away from platforms like Facebook and Twitter and you start talking about services like Pantheon or Cloudflare, kind of more like web infrastructure type companies. What's your take on this controversy?
This is a tough one, and I want to be careful how I represent like what's going on here at a couple levels. Like at one level, I have to say I genuinely believe in the open web. I fear censorship even when I feel like it's very justified. And let's be honest, all roads lead to AWS or Azure or Google hosting. Like at some point, you are sitting on a server with somebody that you disagree with. Like that's just factually accurate. Like even all Pantheon customers, like it's all backed by AWS. The place where I think that this goes into a different direction is that in the LinkedIn threads that are going on there is brought up, and we link to this so you can kind of just, it's interesting from a PR messaging standpoint as well, communications style. This is brought up by a director of strategy at Lullabot, a guy named Greg Dunlap, who is explicit in saying his views are his own. His views are his own when he's bringing this up. But essentially, Josh Koenig, the co-founder of Pantheon, comes onto this thread and essentially says, our roots are open source, open web. We're used by a variety of range of causes, campaigns for political actors. It's challenging when people disagree with deeply on a personal level to use our technology, but we are neither an advocacy organization nor content moderation business. I appreciate the frustration, dissatisfying to a lot of folks. And the place where this sort of falls down a little bit is in two areas. One, they had previously taken down the sort of like pro Russia groups that had been using the site for, as they probably aligned with mis or disinformation about the conflict there. The other part here that's important to note is that it feels like, and now that's I'm using the word feels, which is not sort of viable in a court of law, but it feels like, as a member of the community, and I know Pantheon, we've used Pantheon. I was one of the earliest users. Is that with especially the Heroes program started in 2019? The application is essentially asking for volunteers to give their time toward what was originally, I think, an expectation of a more progressively used platform for social impact. And, when you begin to leverage that type of goodwill for social impact for a community that disproportionately, I would say, identifies as progressive, and suddenly you host willingly, knowingly a group like Alliance Defending Freedom, which you can basically take one quick look at Wikipedia to see that it's freedom as long as you're not in the LGBTQ plus community. That is, it's going to cause backlash. So you're welcome to take the, hey, this is open source, this is open web, but if you are a progressively built platform originally around that community and that type of promise, like you say, it is it's an open market. You can make your choices, and I think there's a lot of heroes that may be tired of donating, because that's the word I'm using: donating, volunteering, giving away their reputation to promote it, their time to answer questions for a platform that would now like to play by different rules. And they're more than welcome to. But you're going to have to, I think, face a bit of this backlash. And this is just interesting to watch because we get and have talked about a lot of cause washing. I'm going to be cause related when it suits me on maybe a day of gay pride or on an Earth Day. And I'm going to wave whatever flag makes me look good in front of whatever customer base. And then tomorrow I'm going to change. And I think we're watching one such organization maybe get caught in needing to define their policies and clearly present to communities that, frankly, are paying attention to a bit more than that, what is being said versus what is being done.
George, I appreciate that analysis and just the nuance around this situation. This is kind of a tricky one, and a little bit distinct, both because of where Pantheon fits and more like of an infrastructure tool, as well as Pantheon's branding, and just in engendering support in that community. And we obviously don't condone anti-LGBT hate at all. My personal opinion is, I think if there is hate or like extremism, these companies should consider taking it down. But I also kind of wonder about, are those infrastructure companies walking into the minefield that is moderation that platforms like Facebook have not even figured out yet. And whether that's a net good or a net positive, what happens when you extrapolate that across not just the United States, but across like the entire internet over the entire world. I think it's a complicated questions. But I appreciate that nuance there. And I think in this, again, my personal opinion is this situation, I would agree that it seems that it did violate the terms of service there, and they certainly alienated their supporters, and probably a net good for them to take it down here, but certainly complicated questions.
I mean, if you want to get even more confusing, the SPLC, right, that has the designated hate group list, I am pretty sure the last time I checked actually uses Pantheon for hosting, I believe. It's that, I mean, there's a lot of groups that end up on sort of platforms at some point, right? Like if I look up and down your stack, you mentioned Cloudflare. Like, I think there's those two elements that you're balancing between. Like, is this an open web debate, or did we potentially choose you as a business decision, like as an agency or an advocate, because we quietly believe that your expressed mission is disproportionately helping progressive organizations, and that's a community to go to. Like they're talking about how other top competitors like a DigitalOcean or a Cloudways or a WP Engine, like they all, if you just look not very, very hard, you'll find designated hate groups on those platforms. So it's not an easy issue, but again, it is very carefully, I'm trying to position around when you have a CSR bend, when you have a community that expects certain levels of alignment toward, frankly, non-hate groups, there's a price to pay for that. You can't have it both ways. You just can't.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. We'll see how this unfolds. It seems like it's the spice is high. A lot of hot takes.
I mean, 173 comments, 22 reposts on this. And this is like only like a week old. It's just interesting.
It is. It is. I'll have to dig up the story. I do think there was an instance actually last year. I remember reading about Cloudflare kicking off
Oh yeah.
an anti-trans platform, and I think their reasoning was it was kind of leading to like real world harm, like doxing and like swatting and like all sorts of like crazy stuff. But yeah, this is I think this could be an interesting question to come back to, because I think some of these infrastructure tools fly under the radar in like the content moderation, like web trust and safety debate, but are just as instrumental to the internet as a Facebook, as a Twitter,
I mean,
etc.
I'll say we have had. I mean, previously Whole Whale's site was hosted on Pantheon. We migrated off. We're currently migrating another one of our properties off of there, and I'll just be honest, like it was a 50-50. Like this kind of pushed me over the edge of like whether to migrate and whether to stay, and that's like kind of getting back to like, oh, if I believe that this was like also supporting like progressive infrastructure and help there, I may have stayed and been like, all right, I'll put up with like these things that are annoying me, but it doesn't take much when you're in a commoditized market called hosting, called hosting a website, be it WordPress or Drupal. Like there are others, and if you're going to differentiate, on this type of messaging, I wouldn't betray it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. We'll come back to this, but I want to take us into our next story. And George, this is an interesting one. This is kind of unusual for us, in that this is actually an almost more academic article, but we posted this from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and the headline is, quote, "News for the Powerful and Privileged, How Misrepresentation and Underrepresentation of Disadvantaged Communities Undermine Their Trust in News." So this article has kind of a long analysis, a long methodology, and goes through this process of conducting interviews with folks all across the world, particularly in the global south, asking them about trust in news. And it seems to be that this distrust in news almost becomes cyclical. Underrepresented communities don't see themselves represented in news stories. They in turn engender a distrust of, quote, mainstream media and news, and that cycle just continues to kind of spiral, right? A lot of folks interviewed seem to view news as like elitist, more mainstream, particularly I would say Western news when talking about in general global South countries, from what I gathered from this article. So George, news literacy is something at the top of our minds. It goes hand in hand with things like digital media literacy, being able to identify mis and disinformation, and a lot of the more trust and safety oriented topics we talk about on this podcast. What was your take on this article, and why is news literacy so important, and what can we do to regain the trust of traditionally underrepresented communities in news? Because it seems like the divide can be pretty significant.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there's like a flywheel here, a flywheel effect of because you see coverage of communities being sometimes relentlessly, they say relentlessly negative, and underrepresentation of the reporting staff and the people that you see bringing that information, and it kind of continues where you just have less trust and less participation and so on. Uh, I think this is part of a larger trend of a shifting away of traditional news sources and media, which is both positive and negative, and like frankly, like beyond my ability to like comprehend the second and third order effects of it. One thing we have seen in other pieces is that smaller media productions, podcasts actually also being sources of information where people are like, all right, I know these folks, they are like me. I think they're part of this community and they're going to report on things that are relevant to this community. So there may be a rise there. We've seen great things out of PRX in the past of increasing the voices of previously marginalized groups. We have friends at newslit.org, which are helping that media literacy. I think there's important things though to look at, especially when you break down um, this flywheel, the five concerns. So, if you're in this industry, go take a look at this article.
Yeah, George, I think that's really important. Also, I think that as American observers, we have a little bit of a skewed understanding of global media ecosystems. I mean, George, you're based in California. I'm based in New York. There is an abundance of news sources and reporting about our communities. America has tons of news sources. Of course, we're seeing the collapse of kind of for-profit newsrooms in this country. We'll talk more about nonprofit newsroom models, but I think for much of the world, just the access to quality journalism is much more limited. I, in particular, spent some time in Eastern Europe, and while there are some great outlets doing great work, uh, students I was teaching had essentially no reliable place to get accurate, unbiased, rigorous journalism in their country. There's a severe lack of journalism as an infrastructure. And just from my knowledge, Eastern Europe, because it didn't exist during the communist era, but I imagine in so many other parts of the world as well. So it's not, I think I would extrapolate this further to say it's not necessarily just a trust issue, it's also an access issue, and actually an instance of privilege. So something, again, to keep in mind. So yeah, we'll continue to talk about this news narrative actually right now because we want to highlight the next story in our summary, which is that this is from newscentermaine.com. A nonprofit group is looking to buy most newspapers in Maine. So there's this one publisher that owns a whole bunch of local papers, and it looks like they were looking for a buyer, and they might have actually found one in the form of a nonprofit buyer, which is fantastic. So I'm looking at the article here, and the nonprofit group that could potentially buy these outlets is called the Maine Journalism Foundation. And on Monday said they hope to buy Masthead Maine, which owns the Portland Press Herald, the state's largest daily newspaper, as well as 29 other daily and weekly papers. So it seems like we have a potential consolidation of Maine newspapers, but being spun into this nonprofit model for potential longevity and stability. We've seen this as well at other major papers, including the Chicago Sun-Times, which became a nonprofit newspaper last year. So, George, what do we think about this?
I just thought these stories went well together, right? We're talking about journalism and how maybe moving toward the domain of nonprofits for a number of reasons, but when you are able to maybe bring the inherent nonprofit trust, right? The annual Edelman surveys show that nonprofits of the four major pillars of where information reliably comes from is higher than the other corporate, media, and government areas. The mixing of these may be one potential path forward, and kind of interesting that all of Maine now may be under this umbrella.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, I'll take us into our next story. And this one comes from Becker's Hospital Review. And the title of this story is that a House bill would give the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, authority over nonprofit hospitals. So we talk about nonprofit hospitals a lot on this program. We have some spicy takes on this. But it looks like lawmakers are reviving efforts to give the FTC authority to investigate nonprofit hospitals for anti-competitive behavior. So Representative Victoria Spartz, a Republican from Indiana, reintroduced a bill just a couple weeks ago that would allow the FTC to enforce antitrust rules among the nation's more than 2,900 nonprofit hospitals. The bill's called Combating Hospital Monopolies Act. This is something I feel passionately about. I don't know. I don't know the first thing about like antitrust and anti-competitiveness law, but I can say from my experience in New York, particularly in the neighborhood I live in, New York, there is such a thing as big hospital. And going from the nurses' strike just a couple months ago, which we covered on this podcast, they're not always super friendly. I feel like there needs to be some more regulation, some more oversight there, especially for these hospitals which, operating as nonprofits, get insane tax write-offs. George, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you, actually. And I think we have seen coverage from, New York Times and others showing the multiple abuses across the country by nonprofit hospitals that fail to uphold their mission. They take advantage of underserved populations that cannot afford services, use predatory means by which to collect when they, in fact, should not, because they get a C3 deduction. They have done cost-cutting measures advised by top consulting firms in the country to do so. And so, just for fun, we installed a AI on our Slack, and so this is through Claude and Anthropic.ai solution, because we love developing and playing with cutting edge stuff. So this was rolled out recently, but I asked it for a hot take, and it actually takes the counterpoint here. And Claude makes the point that the bill's supporters fail to recognize nonprofit hospitals are not typical corporations. They do not have shareholders or lavishly compensate executives. Any market power they possess arises from serving communities that have no other options. Lawmakers should reject this bill and avoid imposing a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation that does not suit the unique role of nonprofit hospitals, and says this would be a overreach by the FTC. I disagree, Claude. I disagree on that front because of the numerous abuses and the fact that if you're getting tax exempt status, you should perform in the public interest. And I think there's been enough violations to suggest that this would not be red tape, but important ways of operating. Take that, Claude.
I agree. Talk about a straw man argument there. No, we're here for spicy takes. I happen to agree with you, so maybe it's good we have a difference in opinion. The resident contrarian to help us out, formulate our thoughts. But no, I agree with you, George. But how about a feel-good story?
Yeah, what do we got?
This comes from World Animal Protection. World Animal Protection is a longtime Hopewell client. And this article is about encouraging animal sentience laws across the world. So animal sentience is an important issue. And the laws that World Animal Protection advocates for are pushing for these laws that recognize that animals can feel, to some extent, emotion, joy, happiness, also grief, fear, and pain. And these laws, this advocacy movement, can help shore up and increase ethics inside of industries such as factory farming, wildlife trade, and entertainment industries. So we love the work of the folks over at World Animal Protection. We love this kind of advocacy. We love animals. What's not to love?
Yeah, I think this is also an interesting moment to be talking about sentience. And, sometimes you blend into anthropomorphization. I definitely butchered that word. Anthropomorphization. I did make that up, but
I think it's
anthropomorphizing
a word.
animals and AI alike right now is actually happening. I think on the AI front, where we're like, oh, like they act like a person and we can easily identify it. But, you know, I think well before we start talking about any rights for AI doing whatever, like let's take a look in our backyard at the sentient creatures going on. And this is a great time to have that conversation. They also pull up other countries that have recognized this. So I like this as a tack because it appeals to empathy. It appeals to how we care for other things that we view elements of ourselves in. All right, Nick, I have a question for you. Why? Why did the nonprofit give up on their penny drive?
Why? Why did they give up on their penny drive? George, I don't know.
Oh, Nick, it just didn't make sense. Well, that's what you get for making the end. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thanks, George.